the way. These are old neighborhoods that were built by the streetcar system extending out of downtown. There are about 100,000 people currently within walking distance, and depending on how you slice and dice it, there's about 6,500 acres of redevelopable land along these corridors. These railroads are built originally for freight traffic, and so they're associated with a lot of industrial land. A lot of that land, after the city, the industry line.
Maybe it's good.
Okay. I'm going to keep talking, and if you can't hear me, please do send us a message. So about 6,500 acres of new development along the way, which are mostly obsolete, abandoned industrial properties or properties that are already starting to change and see new development. And you can see the proximity to town. Downtown here, the large building in the foreground has just been gone into reconstruction for Ponce City Market. That is the old Sears and Roebuck distribution building, the largest building in the southeastern United States, 2 million square feet. It's larger than any of those skyscrapers downtown. It'll be a major new mixed-use district on the Atlanta BeltLine. But you can see beautiful old, interesting old industrial structures, tunnels, neighborhoods that have seen better days, who haven't seen new investment in a long time along the way, but mostly just a bunch of railroads that are underutilized and you can see this shows how the BeltLine is sort of a great diagram where you've got the abandoned railroad in the middle. On either side you have some industrial buildings that are underutilized or abandoned, and on either side of that are the leafy green neighborhoods that Atlanta is really known for and loves about us. If you're from Atlanta, you know that people here love their neighborhoods. Here on the right is West End, on the left is Oakland City. So I won't go into a lot of detail about the all of this, but the project, as I said, started as my graduate thesis in '99 and worked for several years as a volunteer. With the help of then Atlanta City Council President Kathy Ward, we went out into the public, and for about 3 years we created this amazing grassroots movement in support of the project. The people in the neighborhoods of Atlanta really fell in love with this project. That empowered other political leaders to get behind it. At the same time, we were verifying the feasibility of the project, both from a transit perspective and also from an economic development perspective, and found that it's not just a cute little train, but it's actually going to carry tens of thousands of people everywhere and connect them into the MARTA, our transit system, making it more viable and connecting people across the region. And also the economic impact of the BeltLine to the city of Atlanta would be quite substantial, and that led to the passing of a tax allocation district in 2005 that will basically tax increment finance will help fund a large proportion of the project. But it's all that to say that what we went around talking to people about in the beginning about this project was a three-part sort of project. One was transportation, both the transit for the full 22-mile loop. You can walk across the tracks. These are low-impact stations designed for people to walk to, not for people to drive to. And of course, parallel to the transit is also the multi-use trail, so people can bike for transportation as well as recreation. And you can imagine that it will connect the Silver Comet Trail all the way to Alabama and around the BeltLine and out to Stone Mountain. So the regional connectivity that it generates from a trail perspective alone is pretty exciting, and then the transit and another whole layer. The second part that we talked about was economic development, that on the north and the east sides of town that we're already seeing a lot of new growth and development, that it allowed them to maintain their quality of life in the face of that growth and the traffic. And in the south and west parts of town that hadn't seen any new investment at the time for at least 30 or 40 years, it's a way to attract that growth, rebalance it across the city, and bring there the same kind of development, which is walkable, pedestrian-oriented, vibrant street life, connecting those communities as well. And then the third part, of course, is green space, about 700 acres of existing city parks and green space along the corridor, like Atlanta's signature public park, Piedmont Park, also Freedom Park, cultural amenities like the Botanical Gardens, the zoo, the Martin Luther King Jr. Historic District, and recreational facilities. If you don't have an auditorium in your neighborhood, you can get to one on the BeltLine in the next neighborhood up the way. Pretty fantastic. When we started building the coalition that was building this grassroots momentum, it was primarily around three groups of people. One were the communities, the core of the BeltLine vision, which is that people saw the BeltLine as a way, as a contributing to their future. It was a vision for their future that they got really excited about. The second was developers who saw some opportunity. And then the environmental community who saw primarily that would change the way that we start to grow and develop and significantly impact regional air quality. And so those three groups, which aren't really used to being at the same table, wanting the same things, found themselves having really interesting conversations and wanting to figure out a way to make the BeltLine real and make it happen. And what that started to do was generate a lot of other conversations from a lot of other people around the region. And so you had all kinds of people talking about all kinds of things. So you have housing advocates talking to preservationists saying, well, we have things in common. Your goals can support my goals, and together we can get something done. And it was a pretty amazing process to be in, and which benefited the BeltLine, but over time will certainly benefit the city and the region as a whole altogether. And so that initial idea of the transit, trails, economic development, and green space started to expand and become a lot of other ideas. And so, so here's some examples. One is the Trust for Public Land came in 2004 and said, wow, great idea to connect all these new parks. What about 1,400 acres of new parks along the corridor, literally taking industrial land and making them into parks, like the quarry that you see here, which will be the city's new largest park. The quarry itself will be filled with water and offer about 30 days of emergency drinking water to the city, which has additional sort of benefits. Fantastic. The mayor came in and said, let's make this also about affordable housing. What better place to put affordable housing than along a transit line where people can afford to live without a car if they want to. And so now the Atlanta BeltLine is the largest affordable housing initiative the city has ever undertaken. The community stabilization, so that's great for new housing. What about people who already live in these neighborhoods? How can we help? What kind of tools can we put together to make sure that those people are able to stay and enjoy all the benefits of the BeltLine, which is really fantastic. The public art community is coming together saying what a great place for public art in Atlanta, historic preservation. You know, Atlanta's a railroad town. This is our waterfront opportunity. We don't have a harbor or a riverfront. This is a way to showcase the city of Atlanta's public space in a really interesting way. And the Arboretum was an idea by Trees Atlanta, which is our local nonprofit organization restoring the tree canopy across the city. They said, "Wow, what a great place to create a really unique arboretum, linear arboretum, 22 miles long, that not only teaches people about trees, but also urban ecology and stormwater and invasive species and all the other kinds of things that they work on." The public health community got behind the project because they know that communities that are adjacent to transit and trails are healthier communities because it encourages people to walk, reducing their risk of obesity and diabetes and heart disease. The Center for Quality Growth and Regional Development did a health impact assessment in 2007. They'll continue to measure the public health of these communities along the way. Sustainable design I'll talk about more in a little bit, but the last one is street framework, which is really going back to that idea of an expanded public realm, that we're not just building a single purpose infrastructure system here, that it has to be thoughtful and it has to include all the other kinds of spaces and connections that are going to be required to make it really wonderful, to make it work, and to make it really showcase what Atlanta is and create the sense of identity of what Atlanta even isn't, so that we can redefine ourselves from a place that's sort of defined primarily by sprawl to a place that's defined by livable, beautiful, wonderful communities. And so this is an example of how it works. This could be any neighborhood along the BeltLine. This is Capitol View Manor in Southwest Atlanta. That's my house, in case you want to stop by. And this is the yellow there is the redevelopable land along the corridor, mostly underutilized or abandoned industrial properties, but also some obsolete commercial properties. And you can see here how the BeltLine slides between these different neighborhoods. When you layer on the transit line and trail, you can see that that's the sort of initial move being made. But then there's other sites along the way, city properties that can be made into new parks, like the one on the right. And if you saw the little spur trail on the left, that's another rail spur that could become another connecting trail leading out to Fort McPherson. Vacant lots in neighborhoods being reclaimed for new development is infill development, a big part of it. The extension of the streets from the neighborhood to the north, which is called Pittsburgh, across the site, so that not only so that the size of those big industrial tracts are broken up into a walkable scale city block that achieves the kind of walking district that we want, but also that the people who live in the Pittsburgh neighborhood can access the BeltLine across that site. Any one of those blocks could accommodate the Empire State Building. It won't, but the point is that it can accommodate multiple features that we can't quite now imagine. And after it gets fleshed out with some other additional public spaces, the bulk of the site gets redeveloped, probably with a medium density kind of development that supports the land value, it supports the transit ridership, but it's also compatible with the historic communities. So there's been a lot of planning processes for the Atlanta BeltLine over the last 5 to 6 years, especially the feasibility work that was done in the initial days for not only is the project going to work, but also for is the transit going to work, is the economic aspect of it going to work. The redevelopment plan was done in preparation for the tax allocation district. There have been a number of sub-area planning, 10 of them across the city underway or complete now, most of them complete, that look at land use, zoning, heights, densities, parks and connections, all kinds of other things. You can find all those on the website. There is an overlay zoning district that has minor sort of implications for making sure that there are new sidewalks along with new developments, basically. Transit implementation plan is still underway. The additional parks and things coming on each have their own design process, and the corridor design process, which I'll get into more now. All that to say that there's a great deal of work on a number of different levels going on with the implementation of the project and different ways for people to be involved. So you can see some of the things going on. This is the historic Fourth Ward Park that just opened last spring, a fantastic new park on the east side of town, just south of North Avenue, north of the Fourth Ward, Freedom Parkway. A great combination of public space and also stormwater facility that really, I think, raises the bar on public space in Atlanta. This is the Sears building I told you about, Ponce City Market transformation, which is just kicking off. There's been a number of trails underway. This one is on the north side of town near Piedmont Hospital, part of the trail on the north side. The Tony Hawk was down for the opening of Atlanta Skate Park. He contributed money to it and was also there for the opening. Atlanta's first skate park and right there on the BeltLine on the east side. This is the renovation and expansion of Stanton Park down in the Peoplestown neighborhood, another one that just opened this year. And so that's sort of an overview of what the BeltLine is and where we are. I don't know if Ethan, you want to add anything?
Yeah.
Before we jump in.
We could go on that for a while. There are some also parts of the corridor that are open. It's hiking trails, and then there's the West End Trail in Southwest, Gordon White Park, and Rose Circle Park. But let's get to the corridor design. And
also the summer public art program, which is still open on the east side in Reynoldstown, up through around Piedmont Park on the northeast side, and on the southwest side, the whole line up through West End, Westview, Oakland City.
That's right. And more information on the art exhibit is available at art.beltline.org.
And I'm sure there's a link to the main BeltLine website, beltline.org, and you can find more information than you could possibly handle there, which is really fantastic. They do a great job of getting. And I guess the last thing I should say, if there's anybody out there who hasn't who wants to and hasn't taken a tour of the BeltLine, you can sign up for those. There's free public bus tours offered by the BeltLine Partnership every Friday and Saturday afternoon. They've taken literally thousands of people around the city, and it really changes the way that you see Atlanta.
Yeah. And if you are interested in taking the tours, the best way to get seats at this point is to like us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Atlanta BeltLine, or follow us on Twitter. We post, sorry about that, we post when seats become available on Facebook and Twitter.
Okay, so now I'll get into some details about the BeltLine corridor design. Again, I'm an urban designer. I work for Perkins & Will. Hear a little bit about the graphic there. We've been hired by Atlanta BeltLine, Inc., which is the city's implementing agency. They basically take the various money that's available to build a BeltLine, and they build it on behalf of the city, and working with the partners at the BeltLine Partnership with all the city agencies, the Department of Planning, Department of Public Works, Parks and Recreation, Cultural Affairs, Watershed, the Mayor's Office, everybody. They basically coordinate all that process and then the funding and implement the project. And so we, Perkins & Will, has been hired as the prime on the corridor design team. And you can see here we have a lot of design partners in this very complicated process. Our primary partner in the design is James Corner Field Operations from New York. That you probably know their design of the High Line there in Manhattan, which is really fantastic. They've also done a great deal of really amazing landscape architecture projects across the country and around the world. And you can see, I won't go through any detail around all of our other partners, but you can see we have consultants in engineering and surveying, in lighting, ecology, cultural affairs, public art, and all these things that are critical to be able to pull something like this together. I'm going to walk through a number of different sort of aspects that lead into the sort of main ideas in the corridor design. The first section is about analysis of the existing conditions and the programmatic requirements that are needed to build a BeltLine. Then I'll talk about what that analysis led us to. What are the things that came out of that we learned that will then drive the design of the corridor. And also coming out of the analysis work is the design framework. What is the idea behind the strategy of the BeltLine in terms of the way it gets designed? And then there's a great deal of preliminary design, which is the physical design in each section of the corridor. I'm not sure what happened to the graphic there. And then the future design work, which I won't talk a lot about, but we'll just sort of open the door that after this process, there's still a great deal of design work to do in the future for all the different parts and pieces. And that'll make more sense as we get to the next stop. So I'll start really quickly, and I'm going to show you a lot of slides about the analysis work of the existing conditions. But basically, we went through a lot of different, we've looked at it from a lot of different angles. One is mapping, and you can see here how the city of Atlanta rests on the subcontinental divide, and so literally it's a very hilly town, and the BeltLine sort of slices across the hilly landscape. So mapping, historic research, lots of field work going out into the corridor, really understanding the lay of the land, drawing these things, the dimension of things matters, and how it accommodates the topography and all the existing conditions. And then analysis and really thinking together how these things work together to create the BeltLine and what commonalities there might be, what can we learn from the corridor, and all of that. So then as part of the existing conditions description, I'll talk about the context of the corridor, because obviously we're doing something, but we're doing it in a context. I mentioned the topography of the city. You can see here how the city sits on the subcontinental divide. Literally, water to the north and west flows to the Gulf of Mexico, and to the south and east flows to the Atlantic Ocean. And so Atlanta is a high city. The main railroads, Atlanta was created by railroads. but the main lines follow the ridges into downtown. The belt lines slice across the Georgia Piedmont, so sometimes you're way up high above the city, and sometimes you're down in a cut, and you can't even see the neighborhood immediately around you. The city, the region, sits on top of a foundation, literally of granite. You can see it in site walls throughout the city. You can see it in the architecture, particularly of public buildings and churches, institutional buildings. And you can see the great tree cover that the city has, a fantastic green city. So you can see here the railroads that created the city, and you can see the beltlines slicing around it. Atlanta is definitely a railroad town. There are railroads everywhere. And the beltline itself is made up of 4 different railroads. The Atlanta and Richmond in the northeast, the Seaboard Airline in the northwest, the Atlanta and West Point in the southeast, and the Louisville and Nashville after that. These railroads overlap with Atlanta's history. This is the barricades around the city during the Civil War. So the city was much smaller than the Beltline at the time, but you can see a lot of the battles were fought in the territory of the railroads, the future railroads. It also comes in the social context. Atlanta is very well known and has played a significant role in the history of the civil rights movement, for example, among other things. And so the places where those major events happened, a lot of them happened near the Beltline. They didn't maybe have much to do with these corridors, but the communities that are along these corridors were significantly impacted by them and are what they are because of those changes, which is really interesting. You can see the political implications of that as the interstate highway systems were built, literally to block African Americans from moving into certain neighborhoods. And then the political lines, because these railroads were there before the neighborhoods, the railroads are oftentimes the political boundaries between one neighborhood and another, one city council district and another, which is sort of a fascinating sort of role that they play. And also you can see here the orange lines on the aerial map there are the old city streetcars extending out of downtown Atlanta. Had 300 miles of hard track trolleys, and all the neighborhoods that are along the Beltline were created by these trolleys. And you can see how that sort of overlaps. And then there's the sort of unnatural context. What's happened to this area, this part of the world since then? Railroads required a very flat slice of land in a very hilly town. So there were lots of new embankments. Over time, a lot of environmental degradation, particularly in the creeks and the watersheds. The ownership of these corridors has changed over time. Some of them have been abandoned for 20 years, and some of them are still in operation. And that certainly impacts not only the physical sort of quality of the design, but also the implementation and phasing strategy for the project. And then last is the physical context, which really is the thing driving the corridor design the most, which is the physical relationship between these corridors and the communities and city districts and public spaces around it. The next part of the existing conditions is the sort of the railroads themselves, what they look like. And I'm going to go through this rather quickly, but in the Northeast, these are in the order that they were built. The Atlanta Richmond line, which is also known as the Southern Railway, later owned by the Southern Railway Company, and also known as the Decatur Street Belt because it goes down to Decatur Street. On the east side of town, you can see it has both the widest and the narrowest sections of the Beltline, has great frontage on Piedmont Park. It has views of the city skyline, has wide open places and some really interesting landforms. It has a lot of new development already happening along the corridor because these neighborhoods are desirable for developers to come build in right now. And then and some of these images are old too. These are from our original sort of work, and they've already changed considerably. The second is a Seaboard Airline in northwest Atlanta. This is still in operation by CSX, and so you can see it has very open. It will remain active, and so that presents another layer of challenges to this implementation and design in this corridor. It also has a lot of creeks crossing the corridor. This is a confluence of Clear Creek from Piedmont Park with Peachtree Creek, and then lots of new development also on the north side. You can see here's the trail that I mentioned before, built through Tainer Creek Park near Piedmont Hospital. There's under 75. And the watershed, the city reservoirs off of Howell Mill Road. The next one jumping down to southeast is Atlanta West Point Line. Again, this line is still partially in operation. That's not expected to stay. It also is broken by the creation of I-20. You have some really high vistas, a lot of open land to the side, lots of redevelopment area, lots of cool old tunnels. Interesting sort of relationship to the city. Just below this image is the new school to Carver High School. A lot of people potentially going to school this way. And the last one is Louisville and Nashville, which we believe is the last to be built and the first to be abandoned. It's been abandoned for the longest period of time and therefore is overgrown significantly. It also is closest relationships to houses. And a lot of it is down deep in a cut, and so you can't see the communities around it. And then there's the 4 connectors. So in addition to those 4 lines, there's 4 different little connecting pieces that connect them to each other and connect them to MARTA, the existing transit system, which has not really, these pieces don't really drive the main corridor design, but they're certainly in our thinking. But basically, in all of this analysis, what we found is there's a set of kinds of conditions that are very similar throughout the corridor. One is at the track position, that the position of the railroad relative to the city streets is mostly grade separated. It's either above or below, and so getting up and down into the corridor is going to be a challenge, a design challenge, and also an opportunity. Where it crosses at grade, you can see there are a handful of grade crossings, and then there's a few that sections that, because of the subsequent purchase of the railroad corridors, they've been made into streets, basically, so there's some in-street section. The second thing that we've learned was about edges and adjacencies. So a lot of the adjacent conditions are similar. The edges, being a long linear project, there are a lot of edges relative to the amount of land. And not only is that important for access to adjacent properties, but also in thinking about the landscape design and how the kudzu and other invasive species might continuously be sort of invading the corridor. You have a connection adjacent to public spaces. This is at Piedmont Park, adjacent to single-family neighborhoods, and then a lot of adjacencies to commercial and industrial sites, back doors, parking lots, loading docks, those kinds of things.
Hey, Ryan. This is Ethan Davidson. Sure. Just saw a few questions came in.
Sure.
One is, do all sections of the Atlanta BeltLine have space for rail and trail? And is there an opportunity for fiber optic removal of overhead wiring? I'll take a stab at the last one first and say that, yeah, actually, and I think Ryan might get this later in the presentation, but in the East Side Trail that we're building right now, part of that project is a utility duct that will indeed house utilities underground. So it does present an opportunity to remove overhead wiring and create space for future infrastructure needs through that duct bank. And then I'll let Ryan talk to the rail and the trail.
Sure. The bulk of the corridor does have room for the transit and trail component. It is a narrow corridor, and you'll see a little bit of that in the presentation. And so fitting those two things is a design challenge, but also I think will make it a pretty interesting and unique space. In the northwest side of town, where the active freight line also shares the corridor, there are some questions and some uncertainty about exactly how that will all play out. But some sections of trail have already been built there through adjacent properties, and there are ways to connect it along the trail along that corridor using adjacent properties. And so the full trail is connected for the full loop. There are a few places where they diverge from each other, but mostly they're together. So one of the other things that we learned about in our sort of analysis work is that the places where you're most able to connect to the corridor, the street connections, where are the most degraded in terms of the public realm, the sidewalks, the connection point for pedestrians and cyclists. That because these were the back ends of most neighborhoods and the railroad and industrial fringe, that the public realm of sidewalks sort of disintegrates at that point. And so we're going to be making that into the most used highest volume space for pedestrians and cyclists, and so that's a key consideration. Also, every street that crosses the BeltLine is different. You can see all the different variations of that here. Different jurisdiction ownership, is it a state route or a city street? The design of it, the dimension of the clear zone, the dimension of where the furniture is, whether there's trees on the curb or not. This is a great example, this University Avenue, a great example of where a new street is planned to, this street is planned to extend and cross the BeltLine, which is just behind these trees there. Creating an important connection. A lot of new development has created new streets that run parallel to the corridor, which you can see here. There are narrower sort of neighborhood kind of streets, and then there are big major signature streets. You wouldn't know this, but this is Peachtree Street. This is Atlanta Signature Street, and this is what it looks like as it crosses the Atlanta BeltLine. So there's an enormous opportunity here to transform and create a really wonderful connection point between Peachtree and the BeltLine. Here on the north side. Another areas that look like not much interesting right now, this is the intersection of 10th and Monroe in Virginia, but in the future will become a major signature space in the city. So there's a lot of opportunity for that. A lot of new developers go ahead and build these kind of sidewalks. These are the kinds of things that are required under the overlay zoning district. The other thing that we learned was sort of the natural systems and character of the corridor. The waterways, the streams that follow it, that nature has been, for the sections that are abandoned or almost abandoned, nature has sort of been reclaiming things in a really interesting kind of way. There's lots of parks along the way and which have more space for natural systems. There are both invasive species throughout the corridor, but also other species that are trying to reclaim the city. Really beautiful and interesting natural or renaturalizing kind of things, and including some wildlife. This is a huge crawdad that we found down off of Allen Avenue in the Dare Park. The most important thing, I think, from a sort of design standpoint that we learned was the sort of the railroadness of the BeltLine, that obviously these are railroads, and from a landform and alignment sort of idea that's really interesting. That through a hilly town, they had to build these really flat, long spaces for the railroads, and so they sliced hillsides to create that flat slice, and the landform that leaves is pretty interesting. There's a lot of beautiful structures. Some of them are in not so great shape, and most of them are in better shape than that. Some of the structures can accommodate the full program of the BeltLine, the transit, 2 trucks of transit and trail, and some of them can't. And so that's another challenge. These long lines of the railroads, that long trajectory, the flatness and the slow curves are something that are really interesting and unique to this corridor that we liked a lot.
Hey, Ryan,
sure.
While we're on, you mentioned challenges there. A question just came up about Halsey Yard and how we would get through Halsey Yard. This is in the east side of the Atlanta BeltLine, where we would connect what's known as the Decatur Belt, the northeast section, to the Reynoldstown section. And right now, I believe the thinking on that is that we would actually tunnel under Halsey Yard, though no plans are final yet. But that looks like it would be the best option at this point, pending further analysis. Really.
Sure. I mean, what's nice about that is that we've been talking about Halsey Yard for a long time. There are several different options that are that have been studied over time. There are certainly some that are preferred from the Atlanta BeltLine standpoint, but we're not quite at the point where those decisions are being made. What we're doing in the corridor design is making sure that all of those options we're not precluding any of those options, and that we're setting it up hopefully for the best scenario, which is the tunnel. But also not precluding the other scenarios if that's what we have to do.
That's excellent.
And so one of the other things that we learned was that we liked about the existing condition of the corridor is this sort of these track tectonics, which is architecture speak for that basically you have 6 or 8 parts that make a railroad: a track, a tie, a spike, a clamp or 2, and you can build something that from one side of the country to the other. And that sort of system of parts, that modular sort of system, was pretty interesting to us in the design. I think for the design you'll see that. So in addition to the existing condition is also the program. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. But obviously the main three core components of the physical corridor of the BeltLine, not all the other stuff that's going to happen along the corridor, but in the things that have to happen within the railroad corridor itself, the transit, the trail, and the other public space, the space for people. And so this is the transit. So you can see that this is not rocket science. We do this all over the world. This is the Hiawatha line in Minneapolis, where you have the transit and trail sharing. But it is a light rail streetcar type system. I think the decision has been made for streetcar, which is similar to this, only just a little bit shorter. The stations that are required for that, the dimension of the stations, the frequency of the stations, the material of the stations, the way that the stations are connected to trails, how people get to stations, the dimensions, the connections to the local bus network, which is vital for the BeltLine to work, the existing transit network, the platforms themselves, the equipment that's on the platforms, the way that you cross the tracks. All of these things are important to the construction of the transit, and so really having a really good understanding of that. Then next, looking at the trail and the proposals for the trail, both in terms of its dimension, materials. This is an example of how a little connecting piece connects people from the street up to the trail. Basically, entrance ramp, accommodating topography. This is an interesting project in Chattanooga. This is not the BeltLine trail and not proposed to be, but understanding the range of different kinds of trails, trails for running, material surfaces for running, the potential split of people by direction or by node, looking at all those different things, and then looking at how people get, especially cyclists and pedestrians, get to the BeltLine on city streets and through other public spaces. The storage of bicycles, and particularly in the allocation of space for that. And for the trail in particular, we went into a great deal of detail, and I won't go into all of it, but just show you that we looked at dozens of precedent trails from across the world and across the country, both in terms of where they are physically within a metropolitan area, the amount of use that they get, the dimension of the trail, the material of the trail, if they're split by direction or use or not, all the sort of pros and cons of all of those things. These are the range of materials that trails are typically made out of, investigating all of those and making that relevant not only to Atlanta but also to the organizations that are going to be building the BeltLine. And then this is from the EIS, the environmental impact work that's underway through MARTA and ABI with the implementation of transit, but looking at the dimensions of transit and trail together, what is required, the space between the transit and trail, understanding that, the dimensions of stations, really getting a handle on that, the main mobility program of the corridor, which is the transit and trail, really impacting, really driving the design, and you'll see that as we get into it. And then but the last thing being that the BeltLine is not just a place for mobility, but also a space for people to be, a destination in and of itself. And there's lots of places and spaces along the corridor where people want to be and will want to be, and will make the BeltLine into a transformational sort of public space. So social spaces, places for picnicking with a friend or relaxing or in the sun, romantic sort of places, even maybe connecting places to connect from one place to another. Places that might have unique kinds of program, not a river. I'm thinking more about the sort of unique design of the pool there floating in the river. Potential for commercial spaces or leasable spaces or artist spaces that might be on the corridor. Also thinking about the forgotten spaces of the BeltLine, some of which will not be so forgotten when there's more people in the corridor, but there will be some other corners and other places in the corridor that we need to think about. And then skyline views and open spaces, major destinations in the corridor for public art and other things, public spaces, other kinds of program that might be added into where there's a unique sort of opportunity. what the corridor is like at night, what that space transforms into at night, and then how people use it and the elements and things that are required to allow people to go about their daily lives in that design. And so from all that analysis, both of the conditions and all the program, all that leads to something. It has to result in something. And so for the corridor design, where that's headed is that it is impacting two primary sort of aspects. One is the design drivers, which I'm going to talk about, which are the sort of general principles that are true to the corridor and important for the design that we have to keep in mind as we do all of our work. And then the last is the design framework, or the way that the design elements in the corridor organize into a strategy for design, and how that plays out in the corridor. So the design drivers, there's 5 of them. And I'll go through each one. These are sort of things that, again, about the corridor that through our analysis we found were especially sort of important, and we wanted to keep in the back of our minds as we're designing all the elements of the corridor. One is the character, the railroadness, the railroad character of these corridors, but not just the sort of traditional idea of a railroad that's with the tracks and the trails and the flatness, which is important, but also the fact that many of these corridors have been overgrown, they've been abandoned for a long time. And also in addition to that, in terms of character, is the native character of this region, the Piedmont region of Georgia, the native species, the granite and all that, which is important. The second is odd sort of term here, but the multi sort of reuse. This isn't an old railroad anymore. We're transforming it from what used to be a backdoor kind of condition into a new signature public meeting ground, and that change is significant. And so we want to promote it both as a space for mobility and a space for destination. And also it will change over time. Like any good city, it'll never be finished. It'll continue to evolve and change over time throughout the season, throughout the time of day, throughout the years, all kinds of considerations of time. The third was the threshold condition, that this is a special place in Atlanta. This should be a unique space in Atlanta. But rather than sort of building a fence around it to make it special, it's a different kind of threshold. The BeltLine has a history of being having a very engaged public in terms of the planning and the ideas and the concepts and the vision for the project. And similarly, it needs and will require a very porous edge condition to the BeltLine. People need to be able to get to it in multiple places. We're not going to wall it off. But the consideration of that threshold condition is still important so that it remains sort of a special place within the city. The fourth is a performance, basically the sustainability drivers of the corridor, so energy, stormwater, materials, that the implementation of the BeltLine sort of takes care of itself in terms of sustainability, performance, but also where there are opportunities to improve sustainability metrics in adjacent districts or neighborhoods or parks or streets. We definitely want to do that, and there's some opportunities for that, especially around stormwater. And the last is sort of a phased build out. This is not the kind of project that's going to have a ribbon cutting one day and mile 1 to mile 6 is done and you can sort of see the whole thing. This is an evolutionary process. It's going to be incrementally built out, not only in geographic segments but also in scope. So I'll get to it at the end, but you'll see that the East Side Trail is being built, but the transit is still a couple years ahead. So we're going to go ahead and build the trail in that corridor. We're going to come back later and build transit. Right now you can experience art in the interim sort of hiking trail of that corridor. Over time, these things layer into each segment of the corridor, and then also geographically there's equitable distribution of elements over time. So parks in one part of town, trails in another, and eventually the whole thing sort of coalesces and evolves into the BeltLine. And what's important about the design is that it's sort of set up to be implemented in that sort of fashion. And then, so then go on to the next section. Another way that the analysis of the existing conditions and the programmatic elements leads into the design is sort of the design framework, which is the idea of what the BeltLine is. We don't want the corridor to be the same thing smeared around 22 miles. But we do want there to be some continuity along the corridor. We want the BeltLine to be recognizable in one side of town from another so that you can tell you're on the BeltLine. It's an organizing device that orientates people within the city. And is part of that continuity of that sort of signature public move in the city. So those are the two sort of driving things. We feel pretty strongly that the BeltLine as a 22-mile loop is not something that can have sort of a signature sort of landscape move or some big design gesture. That the BeltLine itself is that gesture. But what is required from a design standpoint is a strategy about design, a strategy about how you ensure variety of design along the corridor, and a strategy about how you ensure continuity along the corridor. And so the design is set up in this design framework that allows you to sort of see that. I'll go into more detail about that, but this diagram starts to show that the primary elements that are contributing to the variety in the design are the landscape itself, the lighting, and the public art. And then all the other things are contributing the hardscape, the trail itself, the transit stations, the furnishings, signage. Those things are building sort of continuity, coherence to the design as a whole. And I'll get more into that.
As you mentioned public art, there's a question about public art, and it's about how do we feel about the public art that is existing on some of these older industrial surfaces, street art, graffiti, etc. We've actually, I would say that to a large degree we have embraced kind of urban art, if you call it that. I wouldn't say we've embraced, graffiti, has connotations of sort of, vandalism. So I would not say that we've embraced vandalism or bad street art. But our Art on the Atlanta BeltLine program, which is now in its second year, through that program we've actually commissioned a number of murals which are on the corridor today. You can go out and see them. There's actually several this year on the sides of industrial buildings that are exceptionally beautiful. So I think we do see that as something that's really vital to the corridor. Ryan, continue that.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. I mean, the BeltLine is a big space, a long space, and it's going to there's room for lots of kinds of things, and it's going to be there one way or another, and the challenge is just to make sure that it happens in a way that contributes to the design and the quality of life for residents, and not cheap sort of easy vandalism.
Agreed.
So for variety, we'll start with that because again, the BeltLine. I mentioned that the main railroads that created Atlanta rode the ridges into downtown, but the BeltLines are different kinds of railroads. The BeltLines do not follow those ridges. The BeltLine is a historic railroad term for belting around the city, and again, they were built at the periphery of the city at the time, and so instead of riding those ridges, they slice across the Georgia Piedmont. Atlanta's a really hilly town, and so sometimes where you're doing that slice, sometimes you're way up above the neighborhood around you, and sometimes you're down deep in a cut and you can't even see the adjacent neighborhood. And that slicing across the Piedmont creates a really interesting and rich variety of physical landscapes that are really exciting, that make it really interesting. And so layer that, the landform and sort of the railroad character of those corridors with waterways and crossing streams, stormwater issues, degraded environmental conditions related to that, the existing tree canopy, which is heavy in the west and north and not so much in the east and south, the physical forms of embankments, the historic and cultural conditions of neighborhoods, the development of neighborhoods, people, communities, the way that neighborhoods are physically or not connected into the BeltLine, the streets, connecting streets, communities, skyline views, public spaces, parks and schools. All these things start to set up really sort of recognizable sequence of spaces along the corridor. So sometimes you can see here on this is the east side, but it's turned sideways. North is to the right. So you can see that there are sections, the pink there is very narrow, and architectural almost because the buildings are close and tight, compared to the third section, the orange section, which is wide and broad with skyline views. And that sequence of spaces is what's really exciting about the corridor. And this graphic is inverted, so it's not really helping us. But basically, each of those sequence of spaces then becomes a character room, a recognizable sort of physical space, and that's played out primarily through the design of the landscape, which happens itself at three sort of levels. One is at the bottom, sort of the landform, which is required to change in order to accommodate the program, the transit and the trails, the construction where needed for stabilized slopes and walls, the floor condition, the treatment of the landscape of the ground plane, and then the canopy, which I'll start out, which is a really rich and varied sort of approach to a very different sort of idea about the Atlanta BeltLine Arboretum. I mentioned the idea from Trees Atlanta, and the canopy sort of is the basis for that plan. And so on the left hand, you can see this graphic that implies that there are some existing spaces and specimens along the corridor that are really interesting and unique, existing conditions and features. You know, beautiful old trees like the magnolias off of Ponce that were once part of the Atlanta Crackers baseball stadium. Those signature trees and elements that we want to keep. The second is sort of a large idea about reforestation in Atlanta. This Piedmont region in its native condition is a forest. And so different approaches, there's 5 different approaches to that forest reforestation that are based on some sort of indicating elements of each of these big sections. So the riparian restoration in the north side is because there's lots of creeks there, there's lots more existing tree canopy there, and there is a play off of the sort of riparian conditions there along the corridor. Whereas the west side, the woodland, neighborhood woodland rehabilitation is where on the west side you've got a lot of backyards that back up to the corridor, some parks. It has a sort of backyard woodland kind of idea. And so there's a slight subtle variation in sort of the palette of trees that would be used there versus other sections. And the whole point of that is to sort of have a relatively thin sort of narrative about reforestation that ensures that a similar sort of design strategy on one side of town will still be different on the other side of town because the tree palette, the specimens, the tree species would be different. And then finally are the character rooms, which I mentioned, which are the sort of leading element in the landscape design, which are the sequence of spaces, which are mostly about the sort of spatial conditions and the existing opportunity of each of those different segments. And so here's some features of the specimen trees here. We call this 3-tree hill. It's just near the 4th Ward. It's a sliced embankment that has 3 trees, 3 beautiful oaks left up on top with amazing skyline views. The reforestation strategies basically create a palette of tree species and to be used within that section. And then the character rooms are more about spatial. So some of them we want to stay open to more meadow-like with a few key sort of broad trees that retain sort of so you can keep a skyline view, an open quality, where there are also other areas that are going to be tight, lots of trees, creating a totally different kind of character. So these character rooms, these are just 6 kinds of examples, typical kinds of conditions that might inform the design of each section. But in real practice, literally each section along the corridor would have its own unique sort of strategy. The floor changes only slightly as you go from dry and wet conditions. And then the landform, most sections of the Atlanta BeltLine are not this flat. And so we have to come up with strategies to deal with slopes so that there may be opportunities for the transit and trail to change in their grade, either to accommodate topographic conditions or to improve access to the corridor or simply for the variety of the experience. We also have to think about how we get into and out of the corridor, and then the stabilization of those steep slopes. And so from a landscape standpoint, here are we're investigating a lot of those kinds of strategies. And obviously stormwater in Atlanta is a huge deal, and so a lot of the sites along the BeltLine simply dump all their stormwater into the old railroad corridor, and so we have to handle that stormwater in the most sustainable way possible. In addition to the landscape, another contributor to the variety of experience on the BeltLine is the lighting. This is a corridor that will be open into the night, especially in the winter months where people are commuting home in the dark. The experience in the dark is as important as the experience in the day, and layered on top of that, of course, is public safety and other considerations. So lighting is about that sort of idea, and what we are talking about is sort of a lighting that changes depending on conditions. There is a minimal amount for safety, but that the areas of greater engagement with the public, major crossing streets, plazas, transit stations would have more lighting, and areas in between would allow some amount of darkness to come in, so that you have a different kind of experience throughout the corridor. And the last thing we talked a little bit about public art, which is the opportunity to build on the public art program that's been happening now for 2 years in the corridor, the temporary public art, and maintain a significant amount of temporary changing public art in the corridor so that it remains a space for experimentation and variety, that it changes over time. Obviously there would be a significant amount of permanent public art also in the corridor, and we have some ideas. The design includes some ideas about how there are both large destination kinds of opportunities where real draws for the public in different distributed across the BeltLine in different communities, but then also very small opportunities for public art where most people may never even see it, but if you happen to go that way each day on your route to work or to the park, you might have a special little thing that only you experience. And so that idea of both large and small scale and both permanent and temporary works is an important part of our approach to public art. And so the way that plays out then through landscape, lighting, and public art through the corridors, then we start to get into the design of each segment, mostly the design of each character room. And you can see some subtle variation between these 3 character rooms here in terms of the landscape. But then these are early sort of renderings that were meant more to be about illustrating the variety of space that you might find along the corridor by experiencing these different character rooms. Tying all those things together, obviously you could have 22 miles of variety and end up with beautiful spaces and a wonderful corridor that doesn't relate much to each other except for the fact that there is a transit line and trail. And so a design approach to continuity is similarly informed by the existing conditions analysis, the existing BeltLines themselves. And so the railroad tracks, those 8 elements that you can use to build a railroad from one coast to another, also inform the design of the continuity elements of the BeltLine. So the railroadness of a corridor is informed by the elements, the things, the tracks and ties. The infrastructure of that corridor is what makes it a railroad. And so similarly, we're talking about the infrastructure of the BeltLine being the things that create that sort of design continuity. Literally the stuff that you put in the corridor to make it work. That's the stuff that's designed to tie all this variety together. And so the transit stations, the trail, both in its dimension and material, the stairs, the railings, the signage, all the supporting elements, all the stuff, basically, come from a family of things that have a similar sort of idea about design, a similar palette of materials and colors, and things that sort of tie the whole BeltLine together. And what's important to note here is that then when you start looking at these items individually, the idea is that they are beautiful and elegant, great materials, but they are relatively refined and restrained in their design, and that they defer to the landscape and the variety and the communities of the BeltLine. So when you look at them individually, they may seem sort of simplistic, but built within the variety, the amazing sort of variety of the corridor, I think they're going to do their job quite well. And so this is the trail design that we're building. This is a 14-foot wide concrete trail. It has a medium gray color. It has a sandblast finish. On one side is a light sandblast, and the other side is a medium sandblast. And what that does with the aggregate, the rocks that are in the concrete mixture, is it creates a subtly different sort of shade of gray, so that the lighter side of the corridor, I believe, is always on the inside of the BeltLine. So for the full 22 miles, the light side is going to be on the inside. So wherever you are on the BeltLine, you're going to know which side is towards town and which side is away from town. And so that's an idea. And then in addition to the 14 feet of the concrete trail, where possible, where needed, potentially changing in different conditions, is a 2-foot wide soft shoulder. This is a stone dust kind of trail for jogging and for just additional capacity where needed in the corridor. And you can see there how that adapts to going into an existing tunnel. The public spaces, the paved areas, where there need to be paved areas adjacent to the trail for different kinds of public space programs, would be a granite slab, and they would also use, where they're paved, they're hard surface paved, they would be primarily granite slabs, and I'll get to granite in a minute, but also there will be soft surface conditions within that too, which would be that same stone dust sort of expanding into a public space. The trail itself, or the bridges for the trail, on the left is a new bridge. Again, the same trail, just sort of seamlessly riding across the trail. You can't capture the material quality in this, but this is a beautiful stainless steel railing with the stainless steel wire mesh that creates the panels in the railing, and it elegantly sort of and very simply sort of glides across new streets. There's one that's about to go into construction over Ralph McGill, which you'll be able to watch the construction of here in the next few months. Again, it's to be simple and to defer to the variety of the landscape. And so what you don't see in this image is all the landscape and things in the streetscape and the communities and the development and all that happening around it. That bridge is then adapted to use existing bridges. On the right is the bridge at Ponce de Leon, and so in order to use that historic bridge, it has to narrow a bit to cross it. The walls, the retaining walls where they're needed are drawn, utilizing granite. I mentioned that Atlanta, the entire metropolitan area, is built on literally a bedrock foundation of granite. You can see granite throughout the city in site walls and architecture, in pavings. And so we use that same granite, but we use it in a slightly fresher, sort of contemporary form. Large blocks. These are 10 inches high and 3 feet wide, 3 feet long. They are 2 finishes. There's a polished, not a shiny polish, but a honed finish, which is smooth, and then a split face surface, which is more of a natural kind of surface that forms these bands within that field. And the granite is quite beautiful. It changes in the light, the time of day. As the sun moves, it transforms in the same way it does some of the beautiful old buildings in town. So that's that walls. The transit stations similarly contribute to the continuity of the corridor. The transit stations will be more alike than they are different. Obviously, they do have to accommodate different physical conditions, so sometimes they're up high, sometimes they're down in a cut, sometimes they're in a street, sometimes not, mostly not, but they're basically made from a modular system, a kit of parts, so the canopy will be very similar. The materials and the signage and wayfinding systems on those transit stations would be build a sort of a family of elements that build the transit system across the corridor.
Hey Ryan, regarding the transit station, while we're talking about them, the question has come in about parking. The transits will be designed to walk to. What about outlying neighborhoods? Will there be parking? And I can sort of start this. But what Ryan said is exactly right, that these are stations that are designed to be walked to be serve, serve neighborhoods. Not, I guess, different from what MARTA is today, where you have a lot of stations that have vast parking lots to accommodate large numbers of commuters on trains that have several cars. This is a sort of fundamentally different kind of transit experience. And if you notice in neighborhoods, often there's ample parking just about everywhere you go. But I'll let Ryan.
Sure. I think, what I started off in the beginning with the conversation about the priority of automobiles in the way that we design cities and what we've learned from that. And I think certainly if we want the kind of development, the kind of communities and the kinds of walking, healthy, urban districts that we've been talking about for all these years, then we have to prioritize people over cars, and we have to design these stations and the corridor generally to be accessed by bicycle and by foot primarily. There may be opportunities for some parking. I think that's probably not a lot of that. I think the likelihood of you driving to the BeltLine is probably not actually that high. If you're trying to connect into the regional transit network, you're going to drive and park at a MARTA station. And if you're going to go somewhere on the BeltLine, then you're probably just going to go ahead and drive there. If you want to go by transit, you can ride MARTA to get to the BeltLine and then connect onto the BeltLine. You can ride a local bus network. You can ride future transit systems that will connect at all kinds of places, but it's primarily not to drive.
And while we were having this conversation, another question came up, which I'll start, and I think we'll probably talk about it more after Brian's done. Sorry, Ryan. Excuse me there. But the question is, how do advocates for the Atlanta BeltLine respond to critics who say this is not a regional project deserving of SPLOST funding? And we obviously disagree with that sentiment. And I'll show it in a couple slides after Ryan is done with his presentation. But it is, as Ryan mentioned in the beginning, the last mile. This is an extension of the regional transit network, no different than, say, work on a highway interchange would be work on the regional highway system. It's the exact same thing. It's extending the regional infrastructure to get people to their final destinations. And that's another reason why parking isn't as much of an issue, because you're not going to have to then drive to where you need to go. It'll get you where you actually need to go. So whether you're coming in from Cobb County or DeKalb County or anywhere else, if you get on the transit system, whether it's MARTA or the Atlanta BeltLine or a streetcar going across Midtown or downtown, you're going to be able to get to your final destination using that system.
And I think it's important, and we can talk more about it, but I think it's important to note that the BeltLine is not just about someone from a different part of the region getting into the city and getting to some place along the BeltLine, but like either whether it's for work or for shopping or for some outing like the zoo or the botanical gardens, it's equally important for people who live in the city to connect into the larger transit network and get out to jobs and other amenities out in the rest of the region. And so the city of Atlanta, lost population in the 1970s and 80s, but now is growing almost as fast or possibly faster than the suburban counties in Atlanta. The city of Atlanta is going to continue to grow considerably over the next few decades, and a lot of that growth is going to come in the urban core where there is where MARTA exists and there's a lot of other amenities and infrastructure to handle that growth, where it's close in proximity to employment districts and all of that. And it's important that we're investing in transit in those areas to, the best way to change the way that, to change the traffic congestion problem in the future is to not have one. And that is to change the way that we grow as a region. Not that all that growth is going to be on the BeltLine, certainly not, but that these are the kinds of infrastructure investments that we should be making in to ensure that the future congestion problem doesn't happen, and that people in the future are growing and living in ways that they have access to transit. They're living in areas where they can walk to amenities, grocery stores, employment district, parks, and other things, and that they don't have to get in their car to do everything. And the more cars that Atlanta takes off the streets, the more capacity there is on the street network for other people and growth in the rest of the region. So there is no doubt in my mind that the BeltLine is a hugely important project at a regional level for what it literally does, the physical connections and the mobility experience. In addition to that, and maybe maybe a different sort of angle and maybe not what people are looking for, is that it changes the way that we think about what we want, and that it changes our cultural expectations for how we build Atlanta. And it has already inspired a lot of other projects in Atlanta and people in other parts of the region wanting and looking for projects like this that can change where they live, because we care about not only people in the city but across the region and what their quality of life is going to be in the next few decades of dramatic sort of regional transformation. So maybe that was a long answer. Okay. We can go. We do have some slides at the end that we can go through on the TIA if we want to go through that. Sure. I just have actually a few more slides and to flesh out the sort of continuity elements. So the signage and the wayfinding systems, all the elements and stuff would be part of that continuity. Obviously, for signage, it's important to be to have a sort of idea about continuity. The way that the BeltLine interfaces with adjacent properties, especially with private development sites and residential districts, the connection. So you can see a few slides here. One is analysis of that interface in terms of the intensity of development, low density, medium intensity, and high density development wherever that happens. The physical sort of horizontal setback and separation of the corridor, that varies considerably along the corridor, but there are strategies for how to deal with those different changes. Again, we want it to be a very porous edge. At the same time, we want to respect people's property rights and privacy, and we want the BeltLine to be a special place. We don't want the BeltLine to be, we don't want people on the BeltLine to feel like they're trespassing on some private courtyard or back door or backyard. So that line or that threshold is important. And the last is adapting those ideas to all the topographic conditions, because more often than not, you do have a topographic challenge in that way. And then the streetscapes, where are those primary sort of public connection points to the corridor? In the few places where it crosses that grade, this would be a sort of typical kind of condition. Everyone is going to be different, but this just sort of sets out the family of things that would create this sort of BeltLine moment, the crossing to, it's the BeltLine, the horizontal paving surface, the lighting, the signage, the access points, all of that gets to that. Mostly they are grade separated, and so in a condition like this is similar, except that you have stairs and ramps getting you up into the corridor. Visually, though, the BeltLine is very prominent, because you will see it as you're going along the street. You will see this thing that you're going under, and so you'll see it. But in conditions where the BeltLine goes under you, it's much less visible physically, and so the articulation of that becomes actually much more important where the BeltLine is going forward. So that's all the sort of organizing strategy, the design strategy for the BeltLine, and those are sort of about typical conditions, the family of elements, the sort of strategies for design of how all these things are going to come together. And then, of course, the rubber hits the road, or I guess the steel hits the track, where we start talking about the actual physical preliminary design of each section of corridor, literally the survey, engineered right-of-way of the corridor, figuring out where the transit if you have an existing bridge, is it going to be used by the transit or by the trail? Is it going to have to be moved? Is it going to, are we going to need a totally new bridge? The alignment, the dimensional alignment of transit, the horizontal curvature of that transit is very challenging. The proximity of the trail, the access points of ramps, where are the physical opportunities? You can see this, I don't know if I can point, but on the just to the north side of the top side of that track there, you can see the topographic sort of hill condition. That is what we were calling Three Tree Hill, has an amazing view of the skyline. Articulating those kinds of signature features, signature spaces, alignments, access points, edge conditions, treatments, all those kinds of things are part of this preliminary design process. Where lighting has to go, where the opportunities are for public art, where the key important signage opportunities are so people can find their way both into the BeltLine and out into the community from the BeltLine. Landscape strategies for the floor, for the arboretum, for the trees and how they're planted, that sort of character, and all of that sort of comes together and is made sort of really real in this preliminary design. Now, this preliminary design is just that. It's preliminary. It's taken to about 25% of the full design process. And then what happens is, and I don't have, and all of that is still very much in process, so I don't have a lot to share with you right now on that. Maybe we can do another one later. But for each of those segments that comes together, but then it anticipates future design. So importantly, the idea of this sort of design framework is that there's this continuity of elements that's going to tie all this stuff together. But the really exciting thing about the corridor is all the individual sort of spaces and conditions that create that really rich variety. Again, that's defined primarily by the landscape, but also supported through lighting and art. And so those scopes, the finishing all that design work will happen by, not necessarily by us and our team, but by lots of people over a long period of time, other design teams, other people. So it's important that they have the preliminary work to understand how that area works, how you get into it, what the assumptions are about public spaces, opportunities, views, art, signage, access, all of those things to a preliminary level, and also a palette of materials, plants, all of those things to inform the design, but then figuring out that design and fleshing that out to fully into a construction, something that can be constructed. And this will happen over a very long period of time. As transit gets built, some of it will happen. Some of it will happen in other sections of the corridor where there's some money for a new public space or a public art project. They can happen literally in a lot. I know that there's a bridge that may be designed, and that would fall under this kind of process. So there's an informed sort of starting point for that design, but then it's taken on by another design team that then over time creates a really wonderful and rich experiential condition along the corridor that is also sort of physically tied together. So I don't have much else to talk about future design work, only to sort of make that sort of point. I will say that one of the things that's sort of taken beyond sort of schematics is on the east side, the trail that is being built now under construction on the east side, basically from Piedmont Park down to DeKalb Avenue. And so that narrow sort of element, the trail itself, the schematic design or the preliminary design makes sure that we know where the trail is, that it's not precluding future transit, that it's anticipating transit and access points and all the other future stuff that will be built, but then is carved out as a project in its own right and is under construction. Here's a picture of it right near Ponce de Leon. And we can talk more about that. I'm interested to hear whatever other questions you might have on it. Eitan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I want to add really quickly. A few questions have come in here. We'll get to those in a minute. Before we do that, I just want to show the city's Transportation Investment Act projects, as I think this will sort of give sorry, bear with me for a second here. Give people a good picture of what they're actually going to be voting for. In 2012, when the T-Splosh referendum was up, we were talking about before how this fits into the regional system. As you see, the black lines with the yellow dots, that's the current MARTA system. And the blue lines are the proposed transit project that the city would build if this TIA funding is passed. And as you can see, it includes parts of the Atlanta BeltLine on the east and the west sides, but it also includes transit that goes across town, both in Midtown and downtown. Downtown, it connects to the streetcar project that is currently being built, and across either 10th Street or North Avenue in Midtown. And it connects a whole host of regional destinations for both recreation and employment. You're talking about 100,000 jobs within a quarter mile of the route. So this really does serve the region very well from that perspective, and also from the perspective that Ryan mentioned of people who live in the city but work out in either north or south or east or west of the city. So this is very important for people to understand, and how we came to this point where we were looking at transit not just in the corridor but also into the heart of the city. We started work on a transit implementation strategy well over a year ago, and we looked at what's the best way to build transit now, and we came to the conclusion through analysis of looking at population and employment densities that the best way to do it now for it to be really successful would be to connect into two of the region's largest job centers in Midtown and downtown. So we started the public process looking at this idea about a year ago, and we have been refining it. We're still going through that process. We're coming towards the end of it now, where we're actually going to be prioritizing how we build segments of transit, how we fund them. Obviously, the TIA is a terrific opportunity to accelerate this process and get these initial lines built. And then once this funding is in place and these lines are built, it will definitely serve as a catalyst to attract other funding. Whether you're talking about federal funding, there's other local funding that will be available. But obviously, this is a huge opportunity to get things jump-started right away. And this other slide just shows how some of the other proposed projects connect into this system. So I-20 is another project that's under consideration, proposed by MARTA. They're still going through exactly what the route is, but as you see, it goes, again, right into the heart of this system. The transit line from Cobb, which also, it would not be completed as a light rail project as they had originally wanted under the TIA, but that also comes right into the heart of the city, into Midtown, as well as the Clifton Corridor to the north, sort of closer to Buckhead. But you can see how this all fits together as part of building out the regional network. And if you think about it, sort of like the beating heart that was going to feed the entire body. And whatever future transit is built, if it's connected to this, people are going to be able to get to where they need to go. So we feel really strongly about this. Anyhow, we can look at some of these other questions now. There's a question about, is there a slide that will show what trails or other aspects that are currently accessible? On our website, beltline.org, there is the information. I will apologize right now because we're actually working on redoing the website and making it much easier and using mapping in a much stronger way to much more clearly show what is open, what is existing, how you can get to it. But if you go to beltline.org, on the home page, there's a rotating panel that shows various different projects that are up and running. Obviously, we're still working to improve that. Go ahead.
To answer the question, just verbally at least, is that the East Side Trail that I mentioned is under construction from that map, is currently closed for construction. But there are sections north of that I believe are open for walking and hiking and mountain biking. And then the entire southwest section from Lena Street in Washington Park, which is due west, all the way south to Allen Avenue, which is just east of the South MARTA line. I think about 3.5 or 4 miles is wide open for hiking and mountain biking. It's a really wonderful experience in lots of backyards and tree canopy and industrial areas. It's a different way of looking at the city, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and there's actually a very good map of the sections Ryan just talked about on art.beltline.org that shows where those trails are, where the access points are, and where the pieces of art along the route are.
Yeah, the same section and biking are the same for the art program. So there's another section on the east side of town, north of 20, but south of the East Marta line in Reynoldstown. That's nice too.
And another question here is how is the location of public art, or how will the location of public art be established? And I can start by talking about how we've done this so far. And I would say that it's somewhat of an organic process, similar to how we've opened the corridor in sort of rough state hiking trails, just to get it open as public space. And public art was used as the initial draw to get people into that public space last year when we started Art on the Atlanta BeltLine. The idea was you use public art, but not expending a whole lot of money, but having a really big impact on awareness and getting people in there, and also bringing communities together around art and giving opportunities to maybe lesser known or younger artists or people who just wanted to have the opportunity. And we've had a terrific committee of people, working group with folks from City of Atlanta Office of Cultural Affairs, places like Wonder Root, iDrum, Fulton County Arts, a whole host of other places, neighborhood volunteers. And I would say through that program we have identified lots of really wonderful places to display public art. I think a lot of them are sort of obvious as you walk through the corridor, whether it's a wall that's just crying out for art, or other places that are sort of more hidden. And I think through doing this program over the years, we'll continue to discover new spaces for art and drawing inspiration and new artists out.
Can I add to that? Sure. From the corridor design perspective, one of the idea, I mentioned that there are two ideas for a large-scale approach to public art, which is about sort of distribution of major artworks, major public destination kind of artwork around the corridor. And so we want to make sure that that kind of artwork doesn't just art happen in one part of town. And so we want to make sure that the signature investments, large investments in public art, happen are equitably sort of distributed. And so also at that large scale, so there are about 5 of those sort of identified, initially along the corridor, just to ensure that it gets.
We're back.
Go ahead. Start from where I was, and then in addition to that large-scale thing is a sort of idea that there's small-scale things, and those can happen. There's can be a number of different kinds of things, threshold kind of things where you start as you go into the corridor, you really start experience the corridor. You sort of are awakened to the corridor, but also basically also including the infrastructure in that duck bank that hopefully that Ethan mentioned. To allow temporary art projects to happen along the corridor, so you don't have to drag out a bunch of generators and extension cords across the corridor, but putting in the infrastructure for that temporary system. That's basically, those are the 2 main things for the corridor zone.
I see a couple more TIA-related questions, and I'll try to address them together, but they have to do with the level of funding. If someone wanted $602 million is great. It would be great to have $1 billion. Sure, it would. And the other question is about whether TIA map does not include transit from Piedmont Hospital to Lindbergh and MARTA, which I understand was under consideration at one point. Does that mean that a Piedmont Hospital-Lindbergh connection is no longer a possibility? Well, the short answer to that question is no. What the TIA funding would do is get our system started, continuing from the initial investment made at the Atlanta streetcar there in downtown and extending that. As I said before, having this system on the ground in place, this funding in place, does a great deal to help attract future federal dollars. So that is going to help us build out the rest of it, whether it's up to Lindbergh and Piedmont Hospital, whether it's down to Reynoldstown, whether it's further down southwest to Oakland City and Portland, whether it's more towards the northwest. By having this kind of sort of generous funding in place early on, it will make the whole thing go faster. I mean, that's sort of the short answer. So I hope that kind of addresses those questions. We are going to be using many different sources of funding to build this project out, especially for the transit, since it is the most expensive piece of it. And the more sources we can get, the more we're going to be able to do. Another question, have you decided on the type of train? The environmental impact statement, which is a federal process that's required in order to become eligible for federal transit dollars. We've been conducting that with MARTA for about 3 years now. And we're towards the end of that process and had a series of public meetings over the last 3 years, several rounds of revisions to this. And I don't know if the layperson could really tell much of the difference. It's really more in terms of service characteristics, how they differ from each other, where light rail is typically used to go from across longer distances. You can string, I believe, up to 3 cars to each other. Typically operates in more of an exclusive right-of-way at higher speeds. Modern streetcars, they look pretty much the same. They'll typically operate at somewhat slower speeds, have more frequent stops, and have more neighborhood-type service. So that is the recommendation right now for transit on the Atlanta BeltLine. And then I think we have time for one more of these, but the question is the timing of the East Side Trail construction. I know there's been a lot of interest, and I've even heard that there are people who are using it on the weekends, even though it's under construction, and they're not allowed to do that, so shame on you folks. We are, I believe, on schedule to be complete in the beginning of 2012. There is a lot of work going on the corridor right now. It is a construction zone, so we do ask for your patience, and please stay off the corridor for now. And when it's open, we ask you to use it as much as possible. Take this opportunity to go out and see the southwest corridor down in West End. It's quite nice. Absolutely. So I think we're out of time here, but we want to thank everybody for joining us. Jason.
Yeah, so this is Jason again. Thank you both for coming today. Thanks to everyone for your attention. I apologize again for our network issues there at the beginning. I hope you learned something new about the BeltLine and that you will join publicsquareatlanta.org to continue efforts to bring positive change to Atlanta. We'll follow up with an email tomorrow regarding the archive of this presentation and hopefully get some positive feedback from you about the presentation. And if you have any other questions or comments or future webinars you might like to see, please get in touch with me. You can reach me via email at jparker@pba.org. Thanks again.